Um, so yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks for everybody who's dialed in, and particular thanks to our panelists today. My name's Charlotte. I'm going to be moderating this afternoon's panel discussion for the next hour, and delighted to be doing that. I'm a co-founder of GAIN, Girls Are Investors, and I'm a fund manager at Troy Asset Management. For those of you who don't know, GAIN is a community with charitable status set up to change the status quo in investing by encouraging more women to apply for entry-level roles. And we try and do that by inspiring and informing that next generation. So we hope to do both of those things today. Please do keep interactive, keep on the chat with us. Any questions, we want to hear from you. The topic, and we thank our societies with whom we partner for giving us this subject. I probably should have rephrased it. The role of women in investing is how we termed it. And one of our very astute student ambassadors remarked that it sounded a little bit like an A-level essay question, for which apologies. Also not contesting that there is a role for women in investing, quite the opposite. I got some feedback from the GAIN team who said the role of women in investment is to be exceptional investors and to show the men how it's done. So we could just leave it at that, but luckily we've got an incredible panel who are going to give us a lot of insight into what it's like to be female in this industry, and what the challenges and maybe what are some of the misconceptions. And we've got lots of questions from societies. Thank you to OxWib in particular. OxWib have been marketing this event and have provided us with some of the questions. Also the Cambridge Societies and our wonderful ambassadors, QFIS, CamWeb, Judge Business School, and many others who have been giving access to these events to their members. So thank you, and it's great to have all of you and so many of you on the line. So I should mention that we are incredibly lucky as a charity. GAIN has over 100 women as part of its network, and we've got a really stellar panel here today. So just to introduce briefly before we go into some of the questions and find out a little bit more about the lives of our panelists. Tori Hyman is a partner at Charter Partners in London, and she has a recruitment background, so can give, particularly for those of you looking for jobs in the industry, can give you pretty amazing perspective. So thank you so much, Tori, for joining us. Rosanna Ivory is an investment manager at Standard Life Aberdeen, and she focuses on European equities, so hence our discussion about L'Oreal just now. And Sheena Willis, we're delighted to have on the panel as well, from Bain Capital. Sheena is actually a GAIN regular. I think Sheena was on a panel on Tuesday night and has really kindly stepped in as one of our panelists had to drop out at the last minute, and we're really pleased to have you. So thank you so much. So I think what we'll try and do is firstly start with a little bit of these women's own experiences, how they got to where they are today. And then we'll get into the meat of the discussion about some of the main issues, some of the things that might be putting women off investing, and we'll try and debunk a lot of those myths along the way. So keep the questions coming in, we'll weave them in as and when. And then the final part of this panel, we'll try and make that more specific with practical advice as to how you can learn more about investing and how you can start out in a career, and particular advice for applications and interviews. So maybe just to kick off, and Tori, it'd be great to start with you. Can you explain firstly kind of how you got into the investment recruitment industry and what attracted you to it? What do you like about this particular part of recruitment?
Thanks, Charlotte, and lovely to be here today. It's a great question, because the very short answer is I learned very quickly during my early years of executive search, when I was probably mid to late 20s and working for one of the very large global executive search firms. And it dawned on me that the asset management clients that I was working for were a lot nicer than the investment banking clients. And the other thing that dawned on me was actually that asset management was a growing industry, very much a growing industry. This is about 20 years ago. And that there weren't enough professionals working in the retained executive search market really focusing on investment management clients. And I thought that that's a practical reason, but also they were just incredibly thoughtful people, very much focused on the fact that they were the stewards of other people's money. There was a real fiduciary duty there, and that doesn't always come through in other aspects and other areas of working in finance in the city. And they were very, very long-term and very, very thoughtful. So I'm glad I made that decision, because it's been a wonderful group of clients to work with in the investment management industry.
Brilliant, thanks, Dorian. I think that sort of misconception that investment banking is the same thing as investing is definitely something that we're keen to debunk, and we might cover that a bit more later. Rosanna, just to hear from you, it'd be great to know how you got into investing in the first place. What made you want to get into it, and also your background, because I know that you studied history at university. How was your path to investing, given that you didn't study a subject that people might normally associate with going into finance?
Yes, that's great, Charlotte. And thank you everyone for dialing in on a really hot day. I can imagine that sunbathing is perhaps more exciting activity right now. So yes, I think Charlotte's right. So I gave up maths when I was 16. My A-levels were English, history, Latin, and ancient Greek, which arguably aren't necessarily the straightforward path into investing. And I read history at Cambridge. And then I thought I was going to be a lawyer, because all my historian friends went on to do law, so that seemed like the obvious path. And then I suppose from my personal perspective, there was nothing like this. So I had thought that my life choices from my mid-teens meant that this path wasn't open to me. And all my friends who were going into investing were generally male and generally talked in 3-letter acronyms about which I had zero understanding or confidence. And then I just, through a number of different things, I tried a number of different internships, and I'm a bit of a work nerd. I just had a great internship experience somewhere else, and then my current company, Aberdeen Standard, offered me an internship, and then I was on the grad program, and then here I am 6 years later. And so I think all I would say is that I think the thing that I love about my job is that I have really analytical skills from the subjects that I did, and I'm able to look through a whole host of information and draw out key points, which is very similar to what you do in investing. There's a lot of reading, it's not all numbers, and I just love it, because I think if you're interested in the world around you, for me that's what investing is. It's just being interested, being curious, and therefore each day I feel really grateful to have the job that I do, and the skills that I've learned along the way. And I think maybe to some extent not having done all the traditional route that lots of my colleagues, mostly male, did to get into the industry, perhaps gives me a different insight into a whole range of different industries. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's so true, that diversity of experience, as well as gender, as well as degree type, is all super important on an investing team. Sheena, how about you? Was there a moment where you just realized you wanted to do a job in investing, and when did that come in your life?
So, I mean, a little bit similarly, I studied in Scotland, but I studied history, politics, and art at school, and then went on to study history and politics at university. And so I honestly had no idea about the investing industry when I left university. And after I spent a year as a teacher, and then after that applied to BCG and joined their program, and honestly didn't know that much about consulting either. So for me, the way into investing was I worked for private equity clients on the consulting side and advisory. And I just really it's really interesting work, right? You come across an industry in a company and you find out all about it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you do the same for something else. And I feel, to the same point, and it's not to put off anyone who's done a quantitative degree for sure, but the kind of thing you do in history and politics, where it's around analyzing a situation or analyzing information and pulling out what's important and presenting that in an eloquent way, I think at least the corner of investing that I work in, those are the really critical skills. And so whilst there are more people with a quantitative background than they are a arts background, I actually find it super helpful in what I do, because there's a ton of overlap in those skills. Great. I'm not sure I answered the question of how I got into investing, but the answer is kind of by accident. I knew nothing about it, stumbled upon it, and then it kind of felt like a really interesting thing to try out. And I thought they'd give me my job back if I got fired. So it was worth a try.
That's great. And I think you hear that a lot. Tori, interesting from your perspective, do you see lots of different routes into investing? There must be women who have done all sorts of things who end up in this career having not initially planned to. Tori, are you on mute?
Am I unmuted now? Yes. Yes, indeed. And also what's really interesting, and we've touched on this already, is the different academic backgrounds. Some of the most talented investors that I have met and interviewed over the years have degrees in music, religious studies, we've talked about history, we've talked about politics. So, and that sort of points to the part that we might touch on later about how investing isn't just about numbers and spreadsheets. It's actually about how you think about things related to many, many things going on in the world, and how you critically engage and make and come to a decision. So, but indeed, also in terms of people coming into the industry as investors, a lot of people come into it not necessarily thinking and knowing that that's what they wanted to do. I've met the odd individual, as in, not odd as in strange, but one or two individuals who literally grew up really keen on investing, and maybe that's because their parents were, and they sort of learned from them. But most people find out about it in much more of a gradual kind of way, and often do find themselves on a graduate program or other ways, internships, and they think, actually, this really is quite interesting, and I'm really enjoying this. So there is not necessarily always one specific road into it.
Great, thank you. And then we're going to be very honest in this discussion, because there's a reason that GAIN exists, and that's that there aren't enough female decision makers in the world of investing. And part of that reason is that there aren't enough applicants at entry level. It's around 20% from the surveys that we've done in the investment industry for graduate roles. Now, Rosanna, perhaps you could answer this one. What do you think is putting women off? Is there a misconception about this industry? And presumably we've touched on a few, there are several. What do you think is stopping young women from applying, and what would you say to them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that people ask me a lot, particularly my friends, actually. I think for me it was the acronyms. Is quite a technical industry, the way people talk about things, and I think there's a personality situation there, which is often gendered. And we were talking earlier about this, about how studies show that women won't apply for jobs unless they have at least all the qualifications and more on a job application, whereas in general studies have shown this, and my personal view is it is true as well, is that men often believe, well, we've got 2 of the 5 and maybe they won't ask me about the others, or I'll be fine, I'm really engaging in an interview, I've got all the other interviews I've ever applied for. So I think that has something to do with it. And secondly, I think that the words and the language that the industry uses for women about applying for the jobs aren't always necessarily helpful. And this is something that I've been banging on at my boss about. For example, when we had a new position and someone said, oh, well, if you're a girl, what qualities would you look for? And everyone was saying, like, the girl had to be robust, extremely confident, like using language that what man do you want that's like robust and extremely confident? So why are we saying that we want women? And what environment do you think you're going into if you have to be robust? Whereas actually, like, most girls can hold a logical argument, and it's not about standing up for yourself. It's just saying, like, I agree with that. That's a good point. No, I don't agree with that. And here's my evidence. That's basically what my job is 24/7, is that. Not like, how dare you come at me with this? And I think, so therefore, I think these words that we use, like, a girl has to be resilient in our industry, etc., I think are not necessarily helpful, and they're not maybe it's my personal experience, but I've never felt that I had to be particularly resilient, any more so than in a Cambridge tutorial when someone asked me why I'd written something down in an essay. So those are a few thoughts from me. Maybe that's two passionate opinions, but yeah,
No,
it's a subject that I really care about.
That's great. And I think we often, speaking with young women, they perhaps equate it to a kind of Wolf of Wall Street environment, dog eat dog, and frankly, it's really far from that in my personal experience. Sheena, I know you're in private equity, and the statistics of female representation are actually lower than in other parts of the investing world. How often are you the only woman in the room, and what's the environment like? Is it really hard to be female and to be in the minority?
So I'd actually agree a lot with what Rosanna said. It's not the Marines, hey? And I think sometimes people, for one reason or another, I think the legacy culture is they kind of wanted to believe a little bit stuff that's not necessarily true. I think increasingly, as you have more diversity in the industry, it becomes patently obvious that those are not the traits that lead to success. And it's much more, the things that you would expect on a job based on strong logical arguments and, presenting evidence well. And so I rarely find myself the only woman in the room, because I made a conscious decision, if you like, that there's not a lot of women, but it's definitely really important in the industry to have strong mentors and to work for people that you really look up to. I think it makes the job a lot more fun, and I think it makes it also a lot easier. So my boss is female, and very often we're the only two women, and we get like shocked receptions when we turn up to meet people. But I think, look, there's also a lot of men in the industry who want it to change and want it to improve. There's a huge momentum behind that. I think I've actually found it to be, if I'm honest, a better environment than others that I've worked in, because they're small teams, people really care, and it only takes a little bit of the snowball to get started for it to be a much, much better environment for women. And so, my boss, who sets a really incredible example, makes it much easier for me. Also makes it much easier for, I think, this kind of dichotomy between what men need at work and what women need at work is very fictional. And actually, a lot of the men I work with have professional working partners, and they need a lot of the same things, or want a lot of the same things that I do. And that actually makes it really easy, because it means that you're not necessarily changing it for a minority or trying to make a minority a majority. It's a cultural shift that's happening, I think, increasingly quickly in the industry. And so I've been fortunate to rarely be the only woman. But even in the cases where I am, I feel it's like, I can only speak for Bain Cap, but it's a super inclusive, nice environment. And if anybody didn't walk down that path, I think they'd get pulled up on it incredibly quickly. So it's nothing like Wolf of Wall Street, at least where I work.
That's good to hear. And we have a question as well that's come in on the chat. And Tori, I might ask this one to you. I think that progression of the industry towards actively seeking to hire more women, but also to retain more women. There seem to be lots of initiatives. We've got particularly here asking about whether diversity and women's group are common in investment management firms. I guess I would ask you that, but also what other measures you've seen firms taking to try and retain women as they go through their careers.
The good news is that the focus on recruiting and retaining women in the investment management industry is now stronger than it's ever been. 15 or 20 years ago, it wasn't really a topic, really. 10 years ago, it probably started to come into the dialogue as a proper conversation. And I would say it's in the past 5 years that asset management firms, investment management firms have really bought into the idea, and actually have also really fully bought into the business case, because there is a business case for diversity. So that's great. So it's a clear agenda. It's fully on the table. Everyone's aware of it. The challenge now is how you execute it. How do you change things? How do you get more women into the industry? And to that point, there are, in almost any asset management firm now, big or small, there will be some kind of, or multiple, networking groups, focus groups, any number of internal organizations very much focused on not just recruiting women into the organization, but keeping them there. And Sheena mentioned mentoring, and that continues to be a very, very popular theme, and is one of the avenues that by and large is recognized as being very helpful. You can't be it if you can't see it. So having mentors in firms, again, is something that asset management firms have bought into. So if you were to entertain a career in the investment management industry, you should feel confident that there would be a lot of focus on you and your career from a wide range of individuals and organizations within your organization, which is great. I think the larger question, the harder sort of angle to turn the dial on, is actually how do you make it a reality? And plenty of studies show that if you're focused on gender diversity, where women often tend to fall away from the corporate ladder, is when they may start to have a family. That's not the only reason, but it's a definite key point. And many studies done by McKinsey, done by Booz Allen, done by Bain indicate that the number one thing that women really seek that would make their life easier to both have a career and potentially have a family or look after elderly parents will be flexibility. And included in that might be remote working or working from home. So one of the silver linings we're all hoping out of COVID is that actually managers who have been reticent about having too many on their team working from home too often, and that is still a barrier in the industry. A lot of managers still find that difficult. Hopefully the perceptions on that will now change, because everybody's had to work from home and managers can see that their team is still performing and they're focused on the output. They're not focused on how long you're sitting at your desk for.
Great. Yeah, and I think we can all relate to that. It's very clear that flexible working is here to stay, which is great news for men and women. I have a question that's come in, and I think we want to touch on this as well. And Rosanna, I'll ask this one to you if that's okay. We, as women, as Sheena mentioned, you can stand out quite well in meetings. That can actually be a good thing. You can make an impression by being in the minority. What other skills, and I don't want to use gender stereotypes, but what unique skills, Rosanna, have you, and particularly we've discussed your background, been able to bring that maybe some of your male colleagues or colleagues with different backgrounds don't? I know you touched on it earlier, but it'd be great to hear a little bit about what you feel you bring to the table and why people who've potentially done a history degree or have a similar background as you would be able to bring.
Yeah, sure. I think there's two components to that. One is the hard skills, which I touched on before, and Sheena was also saying, who has very strong analytical skills, just given years of training and potentially how our brains work anyway. I think what's so often underestimated, and what a lot of the studies that I think Tori was also talking about, there's the business case for women is the soft skills. My boss often says to me when I've been away on holiday for a week, he says, like, the office isn't as cheery when you aren't here, for example, or, I enforce everyone to be doing all these charity challenges during lockdown. There's like an angle to bringing the team together and to helping create an environment just because of the kind of person you are. And also, I think that that's the same in meeting with management when you're asking them questions. I think that often what people get wrong is that part of it is about charming people. So they want to talk to you, make it a conversation, you make it engaging. And so there are ways to stand out that aren't like, hey, you said your margin target was this, why haven't you got it? I've written down the last 5 years of our meetings and this is X, Y, and Z. That kind of testosterone field thing. It's like, hey, this must be a really tough time for you guys. Just wondering how you're handling it, and maybe like, is that target going to happen, or how should I help me to think about it? And then people are like, oh, you managed to get these great answers without like pinning them down, because no one enjoys being held up and being told that actually you promised this and you haven't done it. So I think there's like soft skills as well around how you can be as an investor and get actually better results from just being, and yes, it's a stereotype, girls are maybe a bit more chatty or vivacious or charming, but I think it helps create a better environment. And also the third piece I'd touch on is, I think, the psychological element of it. So I think I'm probably like slightly calmer, more stable, like to take a step back from things. So in the fund that I manage with two men, I think, so my boss is quite impetuous, feels quite strongly emotions, like the market's down, this is happening, we've got to do something, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's that whole balance that you can bring by saying like, okay, what did we think yesterday? This is an unprecedented situation. Let's just run through the numbers again. And so I think there are skills that you can bring from a psychological point of view as well in investing across the whole range of markets that help. And those actually you can see in the numbers, because ultimately how you decide when to trade and how to trade is what makes the money for our clients.
Great. And yeah, I've definitely heard that from some really successful female investors, that they just managed to get that little bit more information out of company management teams that their male colleagues are incredibly envious of. And who knows, there are a range of reasons for that. But yeah, I think there are so many, as you say, the psychological aspect is so important. Just slightly shifting to some of the real challenges. And this is for us to be honest, there's no industry without challenge. And I think in investing, as much as anywhere else, it's sometimes hard being a minority. Sheena, I might ask this to you. We have a question on the chat, which is, have you ever experienced any sexism in your job? And is there a process and a culture that you can report that in your firm? Sorry to ask you this one, but...
No, that's quite all right. Look, I mean, being honest, for sure in my career. But so the steps of my career I've done, I did an internship in investment banking, which was a disaster. I then went to work in consulting, and then I went to Bain Capital. And so have I faced sexism? I would say yes, in all of those environments. Also, candidly, at university and during my MBA, I think the reality is the world has a little way to go before people stop feeling empowered to say really stupid things. And so that's a generalized issue. And I've actually reflected on this really often. Being candid, the worst experiences I had were at the beginning of my career. And I feel like as I've become more senior, you're a less easy target. And so I faced fewer problems at Bain Capital than I did previously. But I think that's also probably partly a reflection of the fact that as you become more senior, you're naturally more protected from those things. That seems like a really negative thing to say, but I think it's not completely it would be a bit disingenuous. I do think it's really important when you go into your career, as it's the same reasons women don't apply for these jobs. You know, people tell you not to do it. People have very strong opinions and in their, finance society at university and think that they're like tiny investment bankers when they're not. I think you're always going to face sexism everywhere you go. It's part of what we need to change in the world. But it hasn't been worse at Bain Capital. The forms of sexism that I have experienced is the kind of passing stuff whereby legal documents that say "Dear Sirs" really, really irk me, and I return them and I ask for them to be rewritten. People, the odd person saying the odd stupid thing, either as a management team or candidly, occasionally I've had colleagues. I've got some absolute gems, but my strategy for dealing with that is firstly to, when it's said, point it out, which is a public shaming mechanism that I use. And secondly, I think it's, whether it's a management team or a colleague or someone more senior than you, you don't have to point it out in an unkind way. You can just simply say, actually, I don't think it's only men that are interested in the car industry. That's quite an assumption that you've made. You can take people aside. You can always handle those situations in a sensitive way. But I would say that I haven't worded it very concisely, but it would be disingenuous to say you won't face anything in your career. But for me, actually investing has been better because it's a smaller team and you're closer together.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that ability to speak out is really encouraged. Have your own opinions. Everyone on the team is valued in investing. It means you can call it out. I wanted to ask as well about career progression. And Tori, you have a sort of bird's eye view of this. But would you say that there is a particular kind of sticking point potentially when people go on maternity leave with career progression, and particularly on that subject, what firms have done in the last few years to really improve that and encourage women to be able to have children and keep their careers?
It's certainly getting better. One or two firms have started to spearhead a really interesting way of ensuring that when a woman does go on maternity leave and she's an investor, that she doesn't lose the track record that she's building in her fund. So historically, at most investment management firms, your track record is always important, but depending upon the culture of the firm, sometimes more emphasis will be put on a star or a lead fund manager. Sometimes it's more about the team. But if you are in a position of being the named portfolio manager on a fund, and clients really are wanting to know that you are the one ultimately running that fund and making those investment decisions, it's historically been very tricky for women to keep their career progression when they take maternity leave and have a child and may be out for 6 months. Some may want to be out for a year before they come back. And one or two firms, one boutique firm springs to mind, has done this successfully with a female fund manager who's now had 2 children. And she worked with the firm and she said, I don't want to lose my track record. I'm literally in the middle of building my 3-year track record here. It was a fund that invested very, very much on a long-term basis. So there wasn't a lot of short-term tactical day-to-day, week-to-week trading going on anyway. She got herself set up at home with Bloomberg and Excel and everything that she needed. And actually she was able to remain as the named fund manager on that fund, even when she was at home on maternity leave. Naturally, it required her to also still be working from home whilst on leave to a certain degree. But again, as it was a long-term fund that, and a very concentrated portfolio with not a huge amount of stocks being invested, it was manageable. So that I think actually is completely groundbreaking, and more firms are looking at how they might be able to adopt that, because I think for female investors that has historically been a really difficult sticking point, because often just as you're getting to the stage where you want to build that track record, you're then wanting to take time off to have a family. The other angle or new development that is related to that, of course, is companies like Aviva, and therefore also Aviva Investors, introducing shared parental leave. So maternity leave is no longer now something that only a woman will necessarily ask for. Long story short, if it's shared parental leave, it means that a male employee at a company might say, my wife's having a baby or my partner's having a baby, and I would like to take some parental leave. So from a hiring manager perspective, historically, a bias has always been, well, do I want to hire, this is very traditional, but a newly married young woman who might be starting a family? Am I going to promote her? Am I going to invest in her? What if she doesn't come back? Now, with shared parental leave in place, a hiring manager has to have that conversation in their head about male employees as well as female employees. Not everyone's adopted that, but more firms are, and that is related to your point, your question on career progression, because actually that will have a big impact on how companies are looking at and treating and responding to their human capital, whether you're male or female, and saying, hey, we can manage this. You can have your parental leave and you can still have your career, and not have your career progression being massively interrupted because you're having a family or you need to look after your elderly parents or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's such an important step. And with investment companies behaving more responsibly, I think that's just the way that the world is going. It is actually linked as well to how we, particularly on the investment side, think about our own companies that we invest in. Rosanna, I know you've done a lot of work on this. Young women have said to me in the past, how do you feel about investing as a career? Because the investment management industry hasn't always covered itself in glory in the way that it has behaved. I think that's really changing. And I want to get a sense from you, Rosanna, how you are holding your investee companies to account and what sort of sense of purpose you get from having a job in this industry.
Yeah, it's a great question. If I may first actually touch on what Tori was talking about, because our firm has introduced non-shared parental leave, which is where, it doesn't matter whether or not your partner, wife takes maternity leave, you get paid 9 months, up to 9 months paternity leave for the man, which has just started in the last year, which has actually, I think, been really interesting, because I think it changes men's attitudes, this whole thing, because if they see that they're going to be out of investing for 6-9 months, and I think what a lot of the men seem to be doing is you can take 3 months on, 3 months off, 3 months on, 3 months off. They don't want someone else to take their job. So it's interesting. I've just seen like a bit of a change, as we've had one woman and one man on our team both off, and I think it's changed some of the male view about, like, do I want to look after her fund while she's away, but then who do I want looking after my fund while I'm away? And so I think it's just been quite an interesting psychological development. So I would hope that would continue. So I think what Tori's saying is really interesting. But just on the question of responsible investing, I think it's very fair that it would have put people off. I think both companies and investors, particularly in the sort of the 70s, were in cahoots about making money all at the expense of their employees and their customers. And there were lots of dodgy practices that investors knew about and frankly didn't care about, or maybe even encouraged, in terms of price competition, etc., in order to make the most money. And so, but I think at the moment that has definitely changed. I think there's a lot more transparency. I think there's a huge movement holding companies to account. And to be fair, I think a lot of the management teams at companies also, one, personally want to act in a more ethical way. There are a new generation of CEOs coming through. And secondly, they see that that's what their customers want. If it's recycling, if it's sustainability in your supply chain, for example, with chocolate, being able to know what farm it came from and how it's come through. I think what's actually happening is they're understanding that if they don't do that, then they can potentially lose out on their customer set. So it's helpful because it's like a three-pronged attack from kind of customers, investors, and also employees, because I think they realize that there's actually like an employee retention benefit to working for a more sustainable company. I think that definitely helps for them. But for me, I suppose that overall I see myself as a steward of capital, and therefore I think that I have the ability to sit down with the management team or the head of a nominations committee and say, isn't it, so for example, like Reckitt's 3 or 4 years ago sold most of their products to women. In reality, most women do buy sort of cleaning products for the household, and yet they didn't have a single woman on their board. And they didn't think that was in any way weird or ironic or anything. Whereas you can sit down with them and say, like, hey, by the way, at your AGM, we're not going to vote for your directors unless you bring some more independence on, some more ethical practices, and maybe think about what women you have. And hey, like, we weren't the only people, but we were definitely shouting. And then 2 or 3 years later, they have a much more ethnically diverse board. And it's not just women. It's like, hey, most of your business is now in Asia, but you don't have anyone with Asian experience. Your whole board is German. You're a German listed company. Has anyone ever been out of Germany? So I think in general, your ability to exact change is so much greater than as a consumer just saying, I'm not going to buy this because the package isn't recycling. You can actually go along to someone who can make a decision and say, like, hey, the upside is I can hold you to account and please do something about it. And increasingly, we engage a lot with companies about how that then ties into their remuneration. And I was talking to a company just this morning saying, like, okay, so you have your 2050 environmental goals, but how do I know, how are you held to account on your fuel efficiency if it's not tied into your remuneration somewhere? And so hopefully you begin this, they can't do anything but be more responsible because they have to provide stuff etc. And a lot of the regulators are asking for so much more transparency on climate change goals. And frankly, if you don't wake up to it, your company is just not going to be around in the future. So I think it's a fascinating industry, but I don't think it's a reason not to join. I'd say if you feel passionately, come and be an investor and help exact change, because you have a platform immediately by being able to do something about it. So that's my cool part.
I absolutely agree with that. The fun thing about being an investor is, I mean, obviously I'm on the private market side, but increasingly environmental responsibility, social responsibility, financial goals, especially in the consumer industry, are absolutely tied together, right? That's doing the right thing and having your company stick around are very, very closely bound. And so it's a great position to be in as an investor, because at a much earlier stage in your career than if you were going to work in a corporate or be in an operational role, you have a seat around the table and you can nudge people in the direction that you want them to take. And it's genuinely, it's good for the business, right? I mean, there's no misaligned incentives. And I think similarly to having men taking paternity leave as well, which is one of my absolute pet projects, these things, there's no reason to have bad incentives. Bad incentives are incentives that have been structured in a stupid way. And much like changing things socially or environmentally in companies or changing them in your own company, I think it's a really empowered career, which is quite a lot of fun to work in. You can really get stuff done. Sorry for jumping in.
No, thank you. That's great. I think that's the key. So you can make a difference by being an investor in ways that in lots of other careers it's a little bit harder. And we might just move on, and we want to give some practical advice. So we're going to talk through some of the things that you can do and ask panelists what advice they would give in order to enter this career. And I think maybe the first step, we've had a question about internships, work experience. Tori, do you have a view of the best way to approach this? And someone else has asked, particularly in a pandemic where some of these things are a little bit more tricky, what should a young person at university be doing to make themselves attractive and to also find these opportunities for work experience?
A good theme for that I often mention to people is to be consistent in your approaches to different companies and to individuals in your network as you build it, but not persistent. So it's about finding a rhythm and a method that's going to work for you. A number of times I hear people say to me, well, I emailed Jill Smith in recruitment, but I never heard back. Most people can't keep track of their email, right? It gets buried. People are busy doing their 15 other things. So one thing you do want to do if you are thinking about a career in investment management and thinking about your career is absolutely reach out to a number of firms. And most firms now, even within the crisis, they will have, obviously they'll have a website, but on their website, they will have a place where they will talk about their graduate recruitment, usually have an update on where they're at with it, have some information around it. So reach out to firms. Don't be scared to reach out, because the worst that someone is going to say to you is, no, we're not accepting applications, or no, we can't help you at this time, right? And as you have to sort of think about building your pipeline. So if you want to end up with interviews at 5 different firms, let's say in January, when life might be back to normal, then to get there, you probably have to contact about 50 to 100 firms and assume that half won't come back to you, and then a quarter will come back to you, but then they might not select you for interview, and then the final quarter will come back to you and will select you for interview, but actually maybe it's not right for you. Maybe you don't want to work in Edinburgh or vice versa. So spread your net wide. And also I would say, any way you think you can leverage your network, leverage it. And you'll probably say to yourself, well, I don't quite have a network yet because I'm in university and I'm building my career network. Think about your family, think about relatives, think about friends. think if there's anybody who might be able to help you out, and they may not be a direct connection to where you want to get to, but they might know somebody else who can help you. Beyond that, I would also say, do build your profile on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is becoming more and more popular for a range of companies to be using, even at graduate level. And you want to be on it because many investment management firms and asset management firms will have an internal recruiting team that will post on LinkedIn and will use LinkedIn to reach out to people. So you want to have a profile there that clearly states your aims, your goals, then that you want to get into investing. And you can also follow companies on LinkedIn. So if you're interested in joining Fidelity or BlackRock or some of the smaller asset management firms, they will all have a presence on LinkedIn. And if they are, for example, launching some graduate recruitment or recruitment schemes, they will post it on LinkedIn. So it's about being creative. And then also, finally, I would add, being very consistent with your follow-up. So if you send an email and you don't get a reply, try to put a phone call in and leave a message. If you still don't get a reply, see if you can message that person via LinkedIn. If after 3 tries, you're not getting any response, you might park them and then carry on with the other firms that you're following on with. But don't be discouraged because somebody hasn't returned 1 email or 1 phone call. You have to be consistent. You have to be consistent with your follow-up. People are busy, but you want to keep, don't let that put you off.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. I could have done with that advice about 15 years ago. Sheena, on the sort of non-internship side, but more just in your own time, what can students do to learn more about investing? Are there any resources that you would recommend in particular?
Look, I think I wouldn't separate too much investing from just generally being interested in companies in the world around you. So, and I know there are certainly books and other things that you can read to learn, but a lot of the technicals of the job you can learn once you get there. And so I think, for me, just being really engaged around news around companies and industries and what's changing in the world, and that's specific to the kind of investing that I do. But I think that's the greatest thing you can do, is figure out if you're actually interested in this stuff, because at least for me, reading about finance is pretty dry, and something that I would have, maybe at some point claimed to have done in an interview, but I don't think I did a lot of reading about finance before I did the job. So if you find it interesting to, what's happening with different companies, what products they're launching, why things are going well, why things are going badly, then I think that's a great prep, because it's getting your mind geared into this, analyzing businesses. And that's, for me, at the heart of what the job is. Maybe, Rosanna, if you have anything to add to that, because I didn't do a huge amount of reading.
Yeah, so I'm a podcast boffin because I'm really cool, and I like to listen to them when I run, and there's some amazing ones out there. And I think I completely agree with what Sheena was saying, because sure, you can read like the memos that investors write are quite good, like Howard Marks or Warren Buffett or something, because they're short. I think those like intimidatingly thick books, yeah, I pass on those. But the thing I really like about podcasts is because they interview investors. So it's a bit like this, but with people who are much better than me, basically, and interviewing a whole range of different people on a whole range of different topics. And it covers like the broad spectrum from like seed to like people who do super value investing, who trade all the time, to like so it gives you a sense of different people's journeys, like these companies in the Midwest that have like all kinds of crazy stuff that they do. And so I think it's quite easy to kind of be engaged in a part of it, and to feel to build a picture around like little bits and pieces that you find interesting. So I think that's a great and maybe quite a new resource to kind of to listen to. And the same, like The Economist and the FT, they all do like podcasty things. So I think the idea of like sitting down and learning is quite intimidating. So I quite like like when I'm pottering around the house listening to stuff that I hope filters into my brain over time.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I would also point everyone towards the GAIN website, which is gainuk.org, and the news and resources section. We have lots of podcasts actually, as well as lots of books, which we really recommend for people getting started and finding out more. So please do go on there. We've also, from one of our ambassadors, had a really good top tip for anyone thinking about learning this summer and potentially not being able to do an internship. There's an online Bloomberg Market Concepts course, which is free for Cambridge students 2020 to 2021. So have a look on that as well. I wanted to ask, because it's come through, but I also think this is a really good question for people who are potentially in their second year going to do an internship. The question is, and I'll put this to Sheena, because I think you've mentioned that you've sort of had people that you've managed in the past and potentially have been involved in hiring decisions. How do you stand out in an internship, and how do you try and convert that into a full-time role?
I mean, as someone who did a horrible job in the investment banking internship, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer, but I think in terms of there's kind of two things. There's kind of getting an internship, or doing really well in an interview, and then there's having a short period of time to prove yourself. And I think on having a short time to prove yourself, there's no replacement for a nice attitude and enthusiasm. And I think certainly when people come into Bain Capital, you're always going to make mistakes, you're always not going to know stuff. If you make the person that you're working for happy in their like you're just nice to work with, that can make up for so much bad stuff, right? Because even if someone takes a little bit longer to coach or has a little bit lesser of a starting point, if they're just a nice human being who's enjoyable to be around, I think it's really easy to forget that everyone is just human and wants to be happy and live a nice life. And so that, I think, can make a huge difference, because you can't change what you know going in, but you can always change your attitude. And so that would be my piece of advice for that. My piece of advice for interviews is, and it may be bad advice, I don't know, the others can reflect on it better than I can, but I think how you tell your story is really important. It's the same human interest spark, but there's lots of people who are graduating from a good university with a good degree who've maybe done another internship, maybe not, and making yourself memorable and thinking, who you are, why you became that way, what hurdles you've overcome, what makes you interesting, and being able to share that with someone in a compelling way, I think can really differentiate you in an interview where, to the same point, going in, it's very hard to tell who's going to be a superstar investor and who really has the knack for it. You can't really test that perfectly in an interview. And so being someone that people want to have on the team and are enthusiastic to work with, I think can also make up for a multitude of sins in your interview if you get the market sizing wrong. Or
it's such a good point about telling the story. And I say that to people even 15 to 20 plus years into their career. When you interview, don't think of it as an interview. You are telling people, yes, people are asking you questions, but you are telling the story of you and who you are. And to your point, that is your chance to engage with that person and make them think, that really is quite interesting. The other piece I would add to interviews is, whatever age, whatever stage you are at, do research and have questions in your back pocket about the firm you're interviewing with, and if possible, about the person you're meeting with. Nothing will turn off a potential employer more, again, at any age or stage of your career, than someone who clearly hasn't done their homework. You need to show that you are interested in that person interviewing you and in that firm. And most firms, certainly in asset management, they are looking for intellectual curiosity. And that doesn't mean coming in and said, I've read every book ever written by Warren Buffett. It means showing that you are curious about things, you have questions, and also that you're really passionate and enthusiastic about the possibility of a career or an internship in the investment management industry. You want to show that enthusiasm and that curiosity.
Yeah, thanks, Tori. And can I ask you as well, because this is a question I feel like you're going to be the best placed of all of us to answer, is around CVs. and what should students do to try and make their CV appealing to the prospective employer and also make it stand out?
It's a great question. You want to keep it shorter rather than longer at the early stage of your career. Hopefully that's not too much of a problem, but it should be no longer than 2 sides of one piece of paper. And at your early stage of your career, it's probably it should just be 1 side of one piece of paper, ideally. And internships are obviously a brilliant thing to put on a CV at an early stage in your career before you actually have permanent full-time experience to be talking about and showing. And if internships are hard to come by, then maybe there's another way you've expressed your interest in investing or in the city. Maybe it's through an investment club, maybe it's through podcasts that you listen to, maybe it's through interesting businesses that you followed on LinkedIn. You want to sort of get that out there and get that on your CV if you can. I would also veer away from being too obsessed with sort of personal statements about who you are quite in at the moment on CVs, and everyone has a different view, but my personal view is actually when you're writing your covering email, when you're applying for a role or trying to meet with someone, that's a great time to introduce yourself. Your CV, you want to let your CV speak for itself, your education, your internships, your interests, your hobbies, a little bit about you. Keep it focused on that, and you might also have 1 or 2 different versions of your CV depending upon the position that you're applying for. Don't feel you have to only have 1 version that you always wheel out.
Brilliant, thanks, that's great advice. And
can I say one really quick thing? Sorry. If you've done a job that's like you've supported yourself with a job that you've gone out and done, I sometimes speak to people and they've worked in a supermarket, they've worked in a shop, they've done whatever, and they leave that off their CV. And I think that's a real shame, because there's nothing that I find more impressive than people who've like put the work in, supported themselves through university, like actually really shown a bit of, you know, a bit of personal momentum. And I think maybe, I don't know, at least I've experienced people who've left that stuff off, and I think it's a shame. So I thought I'd shout it out.
Brilliant, thank you. So just as our final question, we like to ask all our panelists this: what advice would you have given your younger self? Rosanna, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think mine is just believe in myself. It's basic, but I think it gets you a lot of places. Because I think humility is a lovely quality, but I think sometimes it's again like quite a female trait sometimes, and all of us on the panel have said the same, like, oh, I'm sure I don't know enough and all this kind of thing. And I think sometimes we have to just be a bit better and cut some of that out, because you know everyone has done something really impressive, and if you're there and you've got an interview, someone thinks you're good enough to be there. So I guess just roll with that.
Yeah, and that's right. Everyone, particularly I think women, often sell themselves a little bit short on the confidence front. Tori, what would you say as advice to young women coming in?
I would say find something that really interests you, because your working career is going to take up a lot of your time, whether you're working from home or working from the office. You find something that really interests you and actually think about what you like to do, and then think about what career you can apply that in. And actually the investment management industry is a great industry from that perspective, because there's a lot of different things you can do working for an investment management firm. You might be an investor, but you might be in sales, you might be in marketing, you might be in digital, you might be in technology, you might be a product specialist. So think about what you really love to do, and then think about what kinds of careers are going to allow you to keep doing what you really like to do, but hopefully also on a really fulfilling and interesting career journey.
Brilliant. And Sheena?
So I think what I would say is to filter the advice you're given into advice that you would give someone else and advice that you wouldn't give someone else. And if somebody has said something to you that you wouldn't say to someone else, whether you believed it or not, just pop that advice to one side. You know, I think it's probably going to be like really not great for you, or, you know, all the discouraging but well-meaning or not well-meaning pieces of advice you get. I think to this confidence point, sometimes some people take those to heart more than others, and I certainly took very seriously every time somebody said that maybe private equity was going to be too rough an environment or too quantitative or anything else. And I went away and I really thought about those things and whether the people, you know, were right. And ultimately, not all the advice you get is interesting. So if you wouldn't say it to your friend, I think you can pop it to the side when somebody says it to you.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to all three of you. That's just been amazing and super insightful, I hope, for everyone who's approaching the industry, and also for those of us who are already in it. Really, really great to hear from you. And for everyone dialed in, thank you so much for giving up an hour of your very sunny Thursday. This is the last in our series of panel discussions for this May. And for the foreseeable, we are going to resume these online events after students have finished with exams, so probably later into June and July. And we'll be going to focus on workshops as part of that. So really honing some skills that you might have been able to pick up in internships. We're aware that those might be more problematic now. So we really want to provide you with access to amazing women like these women that are on the panel today, super inspiring. And we really appreciate your time. So for those of you who want to find out more about upcoming events, please follow us on Instagram. It's Girls Are Investors. And look on our website, gainuk.org, for more resources and more information. But Tori, Sheena and Rosanna, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you, everyone.